When many people hear the words ancient African healthcare, they imagine mystery, ritual, and guesswork. What they usually do not imagine is structure. They do not imagine medical texts. They do not imagine specialists. They do not imagine case-by-case diagnosis. They do not imagine women physicians. And they definitely do not imagine something as advanced as regenerative treatments. What if I told you that one of the oldest documented healthcare systems on Earth was built in Africa, and most people were never taught that? Though some other continent might like to argue without making research. Not as a side note. Not as folklore. Rejecting the notion that it was merely a basic stage preceding modern medicine. But as a serious, organized attempt to understand the body, diagnose illness, treat injuries, manage childbirth, and keep people alive. But that is exactly why this story matters. Because once you see what ancient Africans were doing in medicine, one thing becomes very hard to ignore. History did not just overlook this, it shrank it. The best surviving written evidence comes from the African Nile Valley, especially ancient Egypt, where medical papyri show a remarkably organized culture of healing. Ancient Egyptians combined physical medicine with spiritual beliefs. They used herbs, honey, and surgery to treat wounds, while also praying to gods like Imhotep. Skilled doctors performed basic surgeries and set broken bones. Interestingly, they believed cleanliness and diet were vital, creating one of history's earliest organized healthcare systems. The Edwin Smith Papyrus is famous for laying out trauma cases in a systematic format: examination, diagnosis, treatment, and prognosis. The Kahun Papyrus deals with women's health, and the Ebers Papyrus records a huge range of remedies and observations. And that changes the whole conversation, because this is not the picture people were handed in school. They were told Africa gave the world kingdoms, maybe gold, maybe monuments, but medicine, healthcare systems, clinical thinking. That part is often left in the shadows, so let's bring it into the light. Picture this. Thousands of years ago in northeastern Africa, a patient arrives badly injured, maybe from a fall, maybe from labor, maybe from work, maybe from violence, and instead of chaos, the healer follows a process. Look, touch, assess, decide, can this be treated? Can it be stabilized? Is the case hopeless? What happens next? That sounds modern because, in some ways, it is the beginning of a very old medical logic. The Edwin Smith Papyrus is one of the clearest examples. It does not read like random superstition thrown at a wound. It presents dozens of trauma cases in a careful sequence, including physical examination and explicit judgment about whether the physician will treat the patient. That kind of structured clinical reasoning is one of the reasons historians of medicine take it so seriously. Now stop there, because this is where the stereotype starts to crack. Ancient African healing was not just magic versus medicine. It was often both practical and spiritual at the same time. And honestly, that makes it more human, not less. People wanted relief. They wanted protection. They wanted survival. They wanted meaning when the body failed them. So ancient healers used what they had: observation, remedies, ritual, memory, and experience. That blend can confuse modern audiences because we want neat categories. But ancient people were not living in neat categories. They were living with pain. And pain forces experimentation, which is why another overlooked part of this story is specialization. Ancient Egyptian physicians were not always generalists doing a little of everything. Surviving evidence points to ranked medical practitioners and specialists, including doctors associated with the eyes, teeth, internal organs, and other parts of the body. In other words, this was not just healing as improvisation. It was healing as an organized profession. Think about how huge that is. A society does not create medical specialists unless it has already accepted a deeper idea. That health is complex, that bodies fail in different ways, and that knowledge can be trained, refined, and passed on. That is a healthcare system, not perfect, not modern, but real. And once you understand that, another myth starts to fall apart too. The idea that women were only patients in this story. Because they were not. One of the names often brought into this conversation is Peseshet, a woman from ancient Egypt whose title is usually read as Lady Overseer of the Female Physicians. Scholars still debate exactly how to interpret every part of her role, but she is widely treated as among the earliest known women physicians in history. That matters not just as trivia, but because it suggests institutional roles for women inside the world of healing. Before I forget, Peseshit, Lady Overseer of Female Physicians, lived in ancient Egypt during the 4th dynasty. Known as the famous woman, she is one of the world's earliest known female doctors. She supervised other women healers, helped with childbirth, and practiced medicine at a time when women held powerful roles in society. And that opens another door, because healthcare is never just about trauma and surgery, it is also about birth, fertility, pregnancy, pain, prevention, the everyday vulnerabilities of ordinary life. That is why the women's health texts are so important. The Kahun Papyrus, for example, is one of the oldest surviving texts focused on gynecology. Its treatments are not always what modern medicine would recommend, but that is not really the point. The point is that women's health was being recorded, categorized, and discussed in writing almost 4,000 years ago in Africa. Read that again in your mind. Recorded, categorized, discussed. That is system building. That is the opposite of the lazy idea that ancient African healing was just a village elder guessing in the dark. And then there is pharmacology. The Ebers Papyrus includes hundreds of recipes and remedies for different conditions. Researchers describe ancient Egyptian medicine as a highly professional tradition with a substantial pharmacopoeia drawn from plants, minerals, and other materials. Some treatments were symbolic, yes, some were practical, some were both. But together they show a culture that was constantly trying to map the relationship between symptom and cure. Now here comes the part that really surprises people: mobility. Repair, adaptation, because ancient African medicine was not only trying to stop death, sometimes it was trying to restore function. One of the most striking examples is the ancient Egyptian prosthetic toe. Study of a famous example found evidence consistent with real use in life, not just burial display. Later research from Manchester argued that Egyptian prosthetic toes are among the earliest known functional prosthetic devices. That is an extraordinary image if you really sit with it. Someone lost part of a foot. Someone else tried to help them walk again, not in a science fiction future, not in a modern hospital, but in the ancient African world. And suddenly the story becomes intimate. This is no longer just history of medicine. It is a person, a body, a wound, a craftsperson, a healer, a community refusing to give up on function. That is healthcare at its most human. And maybe that is what gets buried when people reduce ancient African medicine to stereotypes. They erase the tenderness. They erase the seriousness. They erase the intelligence behind the attempt. Now, to be fair, we should say something important. Ancient African healthcare was not a single uniform system across the whole continent. Africa was and is too large, too diverse, too complex for that. The surviving written record is much richer in some places than in others, especially in ancient Egypt. So when we speak about ancient African healthcare systems, we are often speaking about multiple traditions, some preserved in text, others only partially visible through archaeology or later continuity. But that does not weaken the story, it strengthens it because it tells us two things at once. First, Africa was not medically silent. Second, we are still living with the consequences of whose records were preserved, translated, celebrated, and taught. And that is where this becomes emotional. Because once a civilization is denied complexity, everything else becomes easier to deny too. Its science, its institutions, its intelligence, its contribution to the human story. That is why this topic matters far beyond medicine. If people can be convinced that Africa had no real medical systems, then they can be convinced Africa had no real systems at all. No real scholarship, no real expertise, no real innovation, just mystique and myth, but the evidence does not cooperate with that lie. The evidence shows trained healers, texts, specialists, women in medical authority, clinical observation, women's health writing, trauma management, functional prosthetics, not perfection, but civilization. And maybe that is the real headline. What they never told you about ancient African healthcare systems is not just that they existed. It is that they were organized enough to challenge the way many people imagine history itself. Because once you put Africa back into the history of medicine, the old map stops working. You can no longer pretend knowledge only moved in one direction. You can no longer pretend care only became systematic somewhere else. You can no longer pretend Africa was waiting for science to arrive from outside. People in Africa were already studying the body, already recording symptoms, already debating treatment, already trying to save lives, and that should change the way we tell this story, not as an afterthought, not as a curiosity, but as part of the core history of human healing. So the next time someone talks about medicine as if Africa was missing from the beginning, remember this. In the ancient Nile Valley, healers were already examining wounds, recording cases, specializing by body part, writing about women's health, and even building devices to help the injured walk again. That is not absence, that is evidence, and once you see it, you would not be able to remove your eyes from it. Ancient African healthcare systems were not primitive shadows outside history. They were early, serious attempts to understand suffering and fight back against it, which is really what medicine has always been. Subscribe to Ancient Africa Explained for more stories like this.